Box in Chapter 3 discusses democracy, citizenship, and governmental structure. Democratic citizenship. One of the questions we have to explore is the citizenship model based on the community as a collective social group or the individual? Another question, how does the level of commitment to procedural equality affect citizenship and related participation? The classic Republican model of citizenship favors society over the individual. And I should mention here that the term Republican does not refer to a party. It refers to the fact that the United States is a republic, much like Rome was a republic in that we elect representatives. The case of Rome, a little bit different. It tended to come from wealthy classes who were sort of appointed, if you will, almost from within the privileged group versus the way we do it in the United States today. But nevertheless, it was a form of a republic. The classic liberal model favors individual autonomy. Some precursors of American democracy, things that became before we had democracy in the United States, very Athenian in nature, comes from Athens, the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC. It's often referred to as the source of Republican citizenship. But in Athens, only about 15% to 20% of the population were actually citizens, and 40% were slaves who had no rights, and women had no rights. So essentially, somewhat similar to Rome, the well-educated, virtuous males were thought to be the only ones who could really regulate democracy. And this was followed by Enlightenment thinkers, and they helped form the classic liberal model of citizenship and democracy. So as we move toward a new American government, while immigrants came to the United States from the old world to the new and they sought religious freedom, their notions of democracy were still very Athenian in nature. And meaning they still had slaves, women didn't have rights, etc. The forms and practices of the English borough still prevailed. By the later 1700s, Americans began to see a wealth gap in Europe and exploitation of the working poor, and they became very fearful that similar results would happen in their new world. And there were also fears that democracy may spin out of control and large landowners may lose their property to the masses. We've actually seen situations like this in South America, in Venezuela, for example. During the Chavez regime, large landowners in Venezuela had their land taken away through, in theory, democratic action. Relative to contemporary public service institutions, there's an intense debate regarding the size and scope of government, and that really hasn't changed much from the early days of the United States. Again, we have a Republican form of government, which is an extension of the representative democracy. The vertical structure of government, that is, up and down. U.S. has a federalist structure. We have the national government at the top, and then we have various state and local governments that fall down below that. And despite some philosophical conflicts over the roles of strong central versus states' rights, cooperation has generally existed between these levels of government. It's probably fair to say, in particular since, probably 2008 with the election of President Obama, it's interesting that more red states or Republican states were flexing their muscles and trying to have more states' rights because they didn't like what was going on at the national level, and now that's reversed. When President Trump came into play in the beginning of 2017 from the Republican Party, many blue states have been trying to flex their muscles and exercise more state rights because they don't like what's going on at the national level. So it's somewhat relative to who's in power in the executive branch and in the federal legislature, and who's in power in the various states. Horizontal structure of government involves the level of authority internal to one government. Separation of powers at the federal level is an example of that. We have the executive, legislative, and judiciary branches. And separation of powers is rooted in the notion that humans are fallible, and so therefore checks and balances are necessary. We have had fraud, we have impeachment hearings, we have accusations of various misdeeds, and these are supposed to be controlled by or accounted for within this separation of powers to help limit abuse of power. Some more thoughts on politics and administration. This involves the relationship between elected officials and public administration. The larger the government tends to be, the further away from the citizens our elected officials seem to be. And I think you can look at examples of this at the federal level. I think most folks would agree that they have very little access to their congresspersons, and that their congresspersons really oftentimes don't even take into consideration what their constituents want relative to the way that congresspersons vote. As we move down into the state level, there's a little more accountability, but still citizens feel pretty distant from state powers. But they start feeling closer to government at the county level and certainly at the city level. Early on in the U.S., elected leaders were also qualified administrators and actually ran government operations. Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, etc. Were part of a group that was typically college educated. Only something like 0.5% of everyone in the United States at that time had a college education, whereas 40% of the initial framers of the Constitution had college educations. However, as the nation grew and became more diverse and complex, the need for administrative expertise and specialization naturally emerged.